Good evening, everyone, and thank you so much for taking time. Today we have a fascinating topic, and the topic is magic of metaphors. In our practice of looking at business issues from a human-centered lens, we have heavily borrowed from human sciences like psychology and even sociology, like anthropology, etc. So this series, which is the fourth one today, we have reflected on how we have borrowed from the subjects into the business context. So the first session with Vijay took was the entire idea of listening and what does it involve in a good listening, and which was followed by how do we bring our life experiences into work. And the last one, we talked about the importance of context in understanding anything. And so today, we want to delve into this subject of what does metaphor mean? And apparently, they say that every minute we use minimum 3 to 4 metaphors, often very unconsciously. And that is the way we make sense of ourselves and the world around us. And so I thought I'll start the session by asking this question to Rajesh. Rajesh, when we talk about metaphors, there are also other words that we use pretty much together, like analogies and similes, etc. So if you can give us a sense of what is metaphors and what is the difference between these various terms?
Yeah, no, actually that's the right frame to kind of look at metaphors, because our understanding of metaphors happened as part of our English language classes very early in childhood, right? So we're taught figures of speech, like in Hindi it's called Alankar, or in Kannada also it's called Alankara. But we're told that there are various figures of speech like simile, metaphor, personification, hyperbole, onomatopoeia, oxymoron, and there are a whole lot of others as well. So the way we are taught metaphors in English was that it was a garnishing or an embellishment or a kind of a decoration of the language to make it beautiful and appetizing and seductive. So that was our entry into the world of metaphor through the figures of speech as part of English language. And like garnishing itself is a metaphor that I'm using now, that you kind of use garnishing when you cook food, either to give it a certain flavor or a certain color. In much the same way, all these figures of speech are used to garnish the language. Now, two things happened as a result of that. Embellishment, for example, comes from the word bell, which is you add the bells and whistles. I think that must be the history to embellishment. Now, two things happened as a result of it. It was assumed that metaphor, like with the other figures of speech, was purely an act of using language to make something beautiful. It also meant that it is not a hardcore part of the content. It's something like an icing on the cake. It's something that you add. It's something that you kind of make it, something to make language more ornate. And therefore, an act of creativity also came into that. Now, it meant two things happened as an outcome of it. One, it became partially superfluous or ornate or decorative, partially creative also, because people had a way with words, who could use turns of phrases, who could marry different words magically. They were the creative people. So the regular people, it is assumed that the regular people in regular language did not need to use metaphors, or they never use metaphors. So two things: superfluousness, partially a creative angle to it, which is used by poets and songwriters and so on. And the fact is that it's too exclusive. It is an esoteric world, not an exoteric world, which means that people who are the rarefied world would use that. So the outcome of all of this is that we forgot that metaphors is something that we use in our daily conversation. In fact, absolutely, like you just mentioned at the start of this conversation, we use maybe 8, 10, 15 metaphors. I would already use a whole lot of metaphors, and you might already use a whole lot of metaphors if you actually look at what we have spoken in the last 2 minutes. So we know that, I'm using Hindi, I'm sure there are metaphors in all languages. But for example, we know that we tell things like this, right, in everyday language. सीधा बंदा है, या दिल का आदमी है, या क्या रे तेरा क्या चक्कर चल रहा है आजकल, and stuff like that, right? Or there are movies, of course, have tons of metaphors. Gully Boy, for example, recently, the idea of "तू नंगा ही तो आया है, क्या घंटा लेके जाएगा," is an expression of that metaphorical way of using language. Or Dharmendra, for example, in the olden days when he did this pranayama kind of a gasp and told, kutte kamine mein tera khoon pee jaunga. These are all the evidence to the fact that metaphors are used almost rampantly in every second line that we use, and not that it's the exclusive preserve of a few people who are creative and songwriting. Of course, they don't make magical metaphors, but regular conventional metaphors are used by us almost at will, frequently in our conversations. The second part of it, which is act of superfluousness, the fact that metaphor is a decoration is much like how we tell in brand strategy. In the olden days, we used to think that brand is about logo and communication and color and tone and so on. Eventually, over a period of time, the idea of the brand itself changed to the totality of everything that the business does. Like design, for example, we would tell in the olden days, right? I have done this presentation, why don't you design it and give it to me? But actually, design over a period of time became far more nuanced and richer and more deeper than just actually embellishing something. In much the same way, metaphors are moved from this act of decorating something to actually being almost conceptual and central to our thought process, which means that in our language, for example, when we find an abstract idea, let's say like love or life or organizations or any such thing, because we can't find an easy way to express it, we use the help of another dissimilar word to make sense of these abstractions. So, for example, when we say life, what is life? It's too vague. I mean, I'm not talking about life in the biological term, but when you say life as an abstract concept, since you can't easily explain it, you use various metaphors to understand life. One such metaphor is journey, because the world of journey is clearly organized for us. There are people on the journey, there is roads, there are ups and downs, there is a destination, there are things that happen on the way. So in much the same way, a journey is used to understand life. It's one of the ways to understand life. There are many metaphors that you can use to understand life, but one powerful way by which you go beyond the language to the understanding of life because of its abstraction is through the device of journey, which is itself a concept, well-organized concept. So naturally in language, you tell, I'm at the crossroads. I'm at the start of the journey. I had many ups and downs in life. I'm taking a detour now, and so on and so forth, right? There seems to be no end in sight. Things which are a part of the world of journey have got incorporated into the idea of life. So as time and money, or time and enemy. Time can be an enemy, right? So therefore, metaphor now has become a very powerful way to understand abstract concepts through a more concrete concept. And the moment you kind of find this bridge between these two apparently dissimilar worlds, almost like a structure, it almost kind of various things fall like a domino on in a sequence, like an untold journey. You can figure out that journey has been done to death as metaphors in our life, right? Virtually every damn Hindi song, and therefore it's become a cliche as well, and you don't enjoy using those metaphors. Like you tell, Zindagi ki safar mein guzar jate hai do maqam, ya Zindagi hai ek safar hai suhana. Every third song in Zindagi has got safar. O rahi, ruk jana nahi. So metaphor, therefore, so one powerful way to understand metaphor is that it is a way to understand a concept through another concept, which apparently look dissimilar, but helps you understand it far more better because one of them is abstract. So I think that is one way to kind of look at metaphors beyond just the linguistic expressions. Like at the crossroads is a linguistic expression, but you know that in that linguistic expression of at the crossroads, the source metaphor is journey. So my life is at the crossroads. Looks like it's just a use of metaphor as a language thing, but at the crossroads holds the idea of journey behind it. So virtually, if you look at a lot of metaphors, there is a root metaphor or a source metaphor kind of buttressing it or holding it together. So that I think is a little bit of a kind of a long-winded answer to the idea of metaphor. And of course, they are completely different from the world of similes and analogies and allegories and so on. So I mean, today, because we're talking from metaphor, we can take the leniency to Roger similes and analogies and allegories. So for simile, for example, when you use a simile, you tell like something, right? As happy as a clam. She's as beautiful. Her face is as beautiful as the moon, or it's like the moon. So you almost feel like a simile is a tentative or a shy metaphor, which is still not able to express itself. An analogy is a metaphor which is firing its story from somebody else's shoulder, or an allegory is an extended metaphor. You almost use a story to come to a conclusion to understand something about life. So virtually, I think it's such a powerful idea, metaphor, that many figures of speech also lead to the same road eventually.
So, interestingly, the common notion, even though we use metaphors in our regular language, and even many of the examples that you talked about, comes from the creative artistic field. As you said, there is an esoteric uh, halo around it. We use it in art and in poetry and things like that. And also, there's a feel that sometimes you need to be creative because you're making sense of something which may not be very concrete by dipping into another world and then drawing parallels. So bringing that into the business context, Rajesh, because business is seen as a world of everything needs to be clearly understood. It has to be analytical. We have to break down. Even if you take a subject, you tend to use your first principles thinking to break down things and make sense of it. So how does metaphors, one, how do you bring it to the business context? Because many examples you talked about is you use metaphors in a very free flowing situation. That's why it pretty much used in poetry or philosophy, etc. But in a very outcome driven situation like business, when things needs to be clearly understood, uh, because metaphors are figurative, it's not literal. So how do you bridge this contradictions? Because in the business world, normally people look out for clarity. And when it's something is abstract, you tend to say that, tell me clearly what does it mean? And so how do you bridge that? Something which is figurative and literary, analytical to make sense of.
So, two things, Dilip. One, I think I kind of mentioned at the start that where metaphors looked like the preserve of the world of poets and creative people and songwriters and whatever artists and so on and so forth. The fact is that it is a part of our everyday language, and it is used rampantly by virtually everybody, including people from the business world. So our recognition of the fact that we use metaphors may not be necessarily high because it has become a natural part of the language. Virtually nobody in the world uses clean language. We all use metaphors or some other kind of figures of speech. So business in its language is not free from metaphor. In fact, organization, which is the root of a business, which is the place where, or the concept under which business happens, draws heavily from the metaphor of a plant or a tree, like the founding seeds of this company. Let's prune the workforce. Let's take the dead wood away. The company is starting to blossom. So a lot of metaphors, even for organization as a concept itself, comes from the world of biology, which is plant, because we understand that world and we know what it means and so on and so forth. So it's not like businesses, the world of metaphors is outside of business. In fact, if anything, they use it regularly. They may not be conscious of it. And it's also true that a lot of metaphors actually start off, maybe this is my assumption, it's my conjecture that I'm just hazarding now. A lot of metaphors start off a new metaphor or an unconventional metaphor, which is what creates the magic and which is what makes it look like an esoteric world, starts off from the creative world because they identify this strange bridge or this beautiful magical connection between absolutely two dissimilar worlds. Over a period of time, those metaphors then become a part of the daily language, and it becomes conventional to the point that we don't even understand that we are using those metaphors. So for example, growth is up, and up in many ways is an orientational metaphor, because you almost think that everything goes up. This means it's kind of becoming higher and higher. So growth and up and graphs and all, they actually become visual metaphors in the head. So the world of business uses metaphors, but very often cliched metaphors or overused metaphors. When new metaphors come in is when there is a resistance or there's a doubt. Nevertheless, it's also true that bulk of the business people's expression are through advertising, and advertising kind of is fundamentally uses a ton of metaphors. A lot of advertising works on metaphors. We know that in business, when you kind of try to understand brands, we know that clients across the spectrum relate very powerfully to the idea of brand personification, which is you give a personality to the brand. That is, if a brand were to be a human being, what kind of person would it be? Which is what they call as an ontological metaphor. But the idea of personifying a brand is a very powerful way that people relate to. While they all ask us for, in many conditions, they ask us for values and so on. What eventually at the end of a 3-month exercise, what they remember is personalities or some analogies or some similes is what they remember. Because over a period of time, metaphors is no longer the preserve of the few. It has become a part of everything and everybody, and that's the only way we can make sense of the world. For example, if home is not understood through a refuge or a haven or a nest or a creative space or a school or a learning area, if these metaphors are not there, how do you really make sense of the word home? It would have been very difficult to kind of express it through clean language. But we know that, for example, many clients who have in the home space easily use their words like haven, refuge, and all, but they are all actually metaphors which come from some other world. So the world of business, like the world of anything actually, doesn't matter what it is. Like the word, I'm just using law because there is a lawyer in this group today as well. The world of law obviously uses metaphor. To kill a mockingbird is a very powerful metaphor. I was seeing this movie 2 days back, which is I can't remember the name, but I think it's called the finale. I think, if I'm not mistaken, it's about how the Israelis apprehend the last living Nazi guy in Argentina, and again, the use of metaphors in the courtroom is extremely high. So I think it's used gratuitously actually across worlds, including business. While the language that the business enjoys is to tell, we want to be clear, it's a world of Excel and graphs. They enjoy all that because it kind of gives them a sense of control, but quietly slipped into their everyday memory or their everyday communication or their everyday way to relate to things is metaphor. And of course, the cutting edge metaphors are brought by the creative people who open up world for them. So there is a drama around it. So actually, they relate to all of this in many ways. So metaphors actually is fairly deeply embedded into our consciousness. The most deepest form of it being the myth, but deeply embedded into our consciousness and language, regardless of where we come from and what we do.
Okay, that's interesting that you're saying that it is commonly used, because when I was thinking a typical business session, the question came because I thought it's more in the cut and dry, really understanding the pieces, and and that's but when you answer that question, yeah, it makes sense. I mean, it is used pretty commonly. Now, if I take it forward, Rajesh, that what you're saying is that, see, metaphors are part of the language, right? And language creates realities for us. You change the language, the reality can change.
Absolutely.
As I said, in the business context, if it's used unconsciously, it can be either bad, it can be, because that's what is going to create your world, right? And from what I'm understanding is that we use it very freely, unconsciously, intuitively, etc., but not consciously. So what are some of the advantages of metaphors if we use it consciously? And what can be the other side? What are potential fallbacks in using metaphors? And if you're saying that often we use it unconsciously, what could be the issues?
Yeah, I think I'm just kind of spitballing here as I kind of try to answer the question. I think the metaphors that are used unconsciously very often are metaphors that have become a part of the language because of many years of it being used. It has worn well over a period of time, and it becomes a part of, almost without we recognizing, it becomes a quite part of the language. When new metaphors come into the world, or when we're trying to communicate new things for the first time, first of all, finding a metaphor will be, it's a creative act, like Aristotle rightly told, that to find the similarity between absolutely dissimilar worlds, when you actually find it, first there is a sense of doubt, then there is a sudden surprise, then there's wonder and joy, and eventually there's deep understanding. So I think as we're trying to explain new ideas, new products, new concepts to the world, we start to evoke new metaphors, because the old metaphors are fairly boring and people are kind of, it's like a cliche. Nobody really wants to listen to old metaphors. Like if we tell life is a journey, we tell, so what? Okay, so there's no big deal in that. Or, but suddenly if Robert Frost tells two paths in the wood and I took the one less traveled by, it's a small detour from the conventional metaphor. So therefore it evokes interest. Or if Rajnikant tells Yen Vali, Tani Vali, it suddenly evokes something of this lone warrior, the hero who kind of who's taking the road not traveled, in fact, not the less traveled road. So I think to kind of answer the question, I think those that are used regularly become conventional. They are not a part of the thinking. When new ideas need to be expressed, we start to kind of play with new metaphors. And of course, very often, uh, it is a creative act. And by creative act, I don't necessarily mean people who are in the creative professions. Anybody who loves connecting dots, who loves kind of seeing patterns of similarities between dissimilar worlds can easily evoke a metaphor. If you find the right metaphor, actually, it opens, it's like a key. It unlocks an entire world. And like I told, there's a moment of wonder, surprise, joy, and then massive understanding, and you really revel in it. If you choose the wrong metaphor, in the best case scenario, you don't get the magnificence of the communication or the full import or the power of the communication does not happen. In the worst case scenario, you kind of completely kind of lose the audience, or you may kind of give a complete different idea to it. For example, if you say love is a journey, because life is a journey, love also can be a journey, right? We are at the crossroads. We went through a lot of ups and downs. Now, if you call the same love as a disease, उस पे प्यार का भूत चढ़ गया, वो तो पागल हो गया. I mean, you can take an entire world of health and sickness and put it on love also. So, if you don't choose the right metaphor, you could either kind of water down the communication or the impact of communication completely, or you may kind of completely kind of screw it up all. So these are the two best case and worst case scenarios. If you hit the right metaphor, like Apple in 1984 almost used the entire George Orwell's book like a mega metaphor to kind of unleash the story of how technology is going to suffocate us, and the entire Ridley Scott's that entire campaign where people are sitting and watching the screen, and this lady runs in with a hammer and throws it on the screen, kind of vaguely alluding to IBM and the world of blues and the world of stuck-up people who are kind of imprisoned by technology. So if you find such metaphors, it just two runs of those commercial and still lives after 25, 30 years. So so the idea is to always hit the right metaphor. And I don't necessarily think it's an act of the creative people alone. It's anybody who likes to play, who finds joy in connecting dots between dissimilar worlds, and gives themselves the freedom and the license to do it regularly. Is, I think, the kind of the answer to the question that you asked. But part of the question that you also mentioned, Dilip, is that when we say that how do you know if something is the right metaphor, I think, like with poets or filmmakers or songwriters, there is a deep observation of human life. There is a greed almost to kind of want to see a lot of things, absorb a lot of things, be sensitive to a lot of things. That enormous preoccupation with observation, with understanding, with being sensitive to things around, and then continuously drawing connections between these two, actually unleashes the power of hopefully finding the right metaphor and making things magical. Very often metaphors, if chosen well, not only helps us understand something like an abstraction that I kind of mentioned at the start, like life and love being journeys, cooking and ideas is a common metaphorical engagement, or plans and organizations. If you find the right metaphor, the ability of the metaphor to, one, understand things powerfully is great. Second, to communicate it powerfully is also great. But the third thing is, if you identify a metaphor sometimes, it also helps inspire and imagine a world of possibilities, which at the start of identifying the metaphor, you may not have seen it. And there is the powerful story of something in architecture that I think may be worth. Of course, you find it across movies, and right? Of all the songs and poets that I engage with in the Hindi world, one of them is Gulzar. And there's a movie called Ijazat where there is a song called Mera Kuch Saman. In that one of the lines is, एक अकेली छतरी में जब आधी आधी भीग रहे थे, आधी सूखी आधी भीगी, सूखा तो मैं ले आई हूँ, भीगा मन मेरा बिस्तर के पास पड़ा है. I mean, how do you even connect these things so beautifully? It then opens up an entire world of the poignancy of somebody who's kind of asking for a belongings back, both in the physical and emotional sense, because she knows that that's the end of the road to the relationship. So surely in songs, we know that metaphors have been used powerfully, and they're all mass songs. So we all connect to that. It's not like it's an esoteric world. And the act of using that helps us imagine a possibility to that world, because they just unlock something in the head. In much the same way, in architecture, I'll try and see if I can share the screen as I'm talking to it. In much the same way in architecture, and again, both of us were a part of some project many years back, Dilip, you remember, with Asian Paints, where it was during that period that I kind of got curious about architecture and the magic of architecture. It's like the mother of all professions. There is, in Washington, D.C., close to Constitution Road, there is a Vietnam War Memorial. And the story of the Vietnam War Memorial is this, that I'll just tell the story as a way to kind of indicate that when you crack a right metaphor, it inspires, it helps you imagine, it kind of creates worlds which you can't even imagine when you're kind of starting it off. It is just a seed, and then it kind of unleashes itself. So I think the Vietnam War happened somewhere between the mid-1950s and 1970s. It went on for 20 years, and eventually America lost the war and so on and so forth. But when a whole lot of people from the US, and very young kids in the age of 19, 20, 21, actually went to Vietnam for the war, obviously all hell broke loose. Millions of Vietnamese were killed in the war between North and South, kind of between the communist and the capitalistic ideologies. And then when the soldiers started to return home, they faced an unexpected situation, which is that most soldiers who returned home were treated like criminals in their own country. So when people came back home, they were called as baby killers. They were kind of booed out of small villages in which they stayed, saying that you've done something very unfair to the world by their own people. People stopped wearing uniforms and going around because they not want to be attacked or insulted or booed or disrespected. So they are virtually in hiding for a long time. And of course, they're very, very bitter, and they've seen many English movies based on these war veterans. Now, that is the state of a whole lot of people who came back from the Vietnam War. Now, somewhere in the, I can't remember when, but I think somewhere in the 80s or something like that, two people who run a Vietnam War Memorial Fund, Jan Scruggs and Robert Dubeck, decided to build a memorial as part of some inspiration they had watching a movie called The Deer Hunter. They decided to build a memorial for the Vietnam War veterans, because they're all in hiding. There is no voice to them. They're all very angry and upset that they've been abandoned by their own country. So they do a unique thing. They actually kind of put out a competition to the world, which is anybody who wants to give an idea for building the memorial, please compete. And it was an anonymous competition, so you could only see the ideas. You don't know who has applied for it. So some of the best architects from around the world, and surely from the US, apply for this competition. And about 1,400 to 1,500 entries are got. They put up all the entries in the Andrews Air Force camp. And a very distinguished panel of judges actually come and watch all this, and they pick up one idea. Now, this idea comes out of the hostel, I think, if I'm not mistaken, one of the dormitories of the hostel from the Yale campus. A Chinese-American lady from, I think, Iowa, called Maya Lin. She kind of puts out this idea of what she thinks the war memorial should be. And she sends it out to the competition. And obviously, because nobody knows that it is an Asian American who's actually kind of put out this idea. She's not an architect. She's still doing landscape gardening course or something like that in Yale. She wins the competition. And I mean, to the shock of few and the surprise of few, Maya Lin is the person who wins the competition, and she's given $20,000, and she's asked to build this wall. And this is the idea that she had. What she did was, let me just see if I can share. So that I can have a sense of what I'm saying as well. Can you see the screen?
Yeah.
You see the screen? Yeah. So this was the wall. I'll just show you some pictures. I'll run you through the pictures, and then I'll tell the story so that you have a relationship to what I'm talking. Yeah. So what she did was, in Washington, D.C., there are two monuments. One is a Lincoln Memorial, again a memorial to Lincoln, and on the other side, exactly like a straight line. So it's we are all sitting where the Lincoln Memorial is. Exactly opposite us is the Washington Monument. On the left-hand side, there's an absolutely empty ground. On that empty ground, which is the land given by the Congress for building the war memorial, in a chevron shape, like a kind of at a 135-degree angle, she kind of creates a crater into the earth, almost like shaves off the earth, almost in a gradient, which kind of like you can see, it's kind of going down. At the middle of the wall, there's a 10 feet height, and then it is at 135-degree. You find two walls, one which kind of points towards Lincoln Memorial, and one which points towards the Washington Monument. And on this wall, she does something absolutely bizarre or brilliant for those times. Because till then, most war memorials were of this type, right? You would have soldiers with guns or somebody on a horseback, and we see many of this around our country as well. Maybe a battle tank. The standard war memorials are all this. She comes up with an absolutely fresh idea, which is that she tells that I almost imagine taking a knife and cutting into the earth and kind of opening it up and putting this wall there almost to kind of show the world that this is a wound. It's a pain that's been inflicted, and this is the wound that is healing. And on that wall, which is absolutely stunning, shiny granite walls, and you can see the pictures as well, almost like a mirror. And those granite slabs are sourced from India because she really wanted people to see their image as well. Not from Sweden, because many people who kind of avoided the draft ran away to Sweden, so it's an issue. Not from South Africa, because well, you had decent granite there, it had an apartheid connotation. So into this wall, she inscribed all the 58,000 odd names one by one in a certain chronological sequence. Now, the idea of this wall being kind of representing a deep wound that is starting to heal, and her absolute presence in understanding that people connect to their loved ones through the name. So, in the 2 or 3 times that I visited the wall, I would stand there for an hour and a half, 2 hours. And what would happen is people would first come in, the loved ones of those who lost their loved ones in the war, maybe a brother, maybe a father, maybe a mother, whoever it is. The first thing is there's an enormous moment of anticipation and kind of an emotional kind of catharsis where they're starting to search for the name. And these are 57,000 names, right? So just kind of moving across the walls, trying to find the name. And at some point, after this search, and of course, there's a directory and so on and so forth, they find the name. And the first thing they all do is to actually go and touch the name. And the moment they touch the name, they close their eyes and they just kind of go into a kind of a quiet silence mode of reflection, of trying to connect back. The fact that the name can be a gateway to the people who you're lost, and the only way to connect to that soul. And by doing that, you're actually kind of healing both the people who are left behind, who are the people who came back from the war, as well as the families of those who lost but are now kind of bearing the stigma of their kids being bombers and baby killers and whatever ABCD. So she saw this metaphor of a wound that is healing. And as the person is touching the name on the wall, he's also seeing his reflection on that name. So when you stand there, people just go into this quiet, silent, reflective rapture, internal rapture kind of a mood. And they're there for long periods of time. And when they leave the place, the emotion is so powerful that they leave behind a lot of their personal effects. So there's a massive museum nearby with nearly 500,000 effects, including a Harley Davidson motorbike, because it just kind of disturbs you and heals you emotionally at the same point in time. So Maryland's capability to actually take a war memorial, which till then was always this bust or the soldier on a horseback or a rifle carrying fellow or whatever that is. And there is one apology of a memorial also exactly opposite, which was like a compromise that she had to do because they tried to kind of kill this 100 times. Ross Perot was a presidential candidate, tried to fund a campaign to kill the wall. The veterans themselves were very worried. There are a whole lot of metaphors that were used to express the wall, like a gash of shame, a nihilist slab of stone, a boomerang that will come to, because it had a 135-degree angle, right? It's a boomerang that's going to come and embarrass us. It looks like it's a sign for victory, but actually we got defeated. So there are a whole lot of negative metaphors that were used to kind of kill that wall. She was a 19 or 20 or a 21-year-old yet to be graduate. She kind of sticks to her guns and doesn't change it. She kind of goes through with it. And eventually on the day it's launched, somewhere in November 1982, thousands of veterans come. I think Reagan is the person who kind of opens it up. Many of them tell powerful stories of how they were stuck there for 5, 6, 7 hours and how they come many, many times after that to the wall because they started to heal. Something dramatic happened to them, just the act of touching the name. And many of them, we noticed that they actually put the tracing paper on the wall and they trace out the name. It's called rubbing. They trace out the name of the loved ones and they take the tracing paper back. What a brilliant thought to kind of do all this. And all of this in one wall, that it suddenly transformed from this world of shame and embarrassment and not being in uniform and hiding to it being a healing wall. And now they call it like a shrine. That's a new metaphor used for it. It's almost like a shrine for the war veterans. And Mylan, of course, becomes a specialist in building memorials. That's not a great thing, but I'm sure she's built things beyond memorials, but she almost became like a war memorial veteran. But the power of this metaphor to evoke something so dramatic, to inspire, to kind of be a kernel, and then obviously when she put out this drawing, it must have been something that she thought. But to unleash this emotional catharsis and healing and its power to change the world of those who are engaged with it, and even people like us who go and watch it, you are touched by it. You wonder what is this gradient, why is it in this formation? You walk through the wall, you see people in deep reflection. So metaphors in its best form, be it in architecture or the Ijazat song that I talked about, or Fire in Babylon, they evoke something really powerful, so much so that it can open our world, and then our world will now be the same again. And we use that in business or in law or in films or in daily conversations. We would all be kind of powerful and great. I mean, we would feel wondrous and magical about it. And again, I feel like it's not the preserve of creative people. Creative people have a particular knack of doing it. Poets have a brilliant knack of doing it. But if you just enjoy playing with these things and use the idea of play and connect random things, over a period of time, you'll find out beautiful metaphors in life.
No, the My Island story is a very inspiring story, beautifully captured. Because it gives you a sense that that emotions would have been very difficult to articulate in plain, simple language. You needed a metaphor. But at the same time, Rajesh, it also looks like the responsibility of the usage of metaphor. If you take the My Islands, it's not that the others didn't use metaphor. Others had metaphors which was negative and portrayed a certain kind of world around that, monument or the entire war. So, I mean, she used it positively. That also is dependent on that person's worldview itself, right? How she views the world, how she thinks the world should be, and to communicate that, and maybe even for her understanding, she has tapped into this metaphor. So here comes the question of, because it looks like it is a really responsible act then to use metaphors. And I'm connecting to where we started the conversation, that we unconsciously use metaphors. Like every minute we may be using 3 to 4. And if it's negative, because that's the language and that's what creates the world. So if it's, in My Island's case, it looks like she had a very deep understanding of what's gone through. She had a take on it. And based on that, she had a metaphor which was inspiring and positive. So if metaphors not used responsibly, it could, at one end, could become very loose talk, frivolous, and you don't take it seriously. Or it could be very destructive also. So the question that I want to ask you is that, is it important that if I have to use metaphor responsibly, I need to have a great understanding of the subject. I need to have a great empathy on the subject. Maybe some kind of a wisdom around that, If not, is it safer to stick to facts and figures, which is the literary part of it? Or is there a way that you can use it in combination? Example, like if I take COVID, one, I can say it's like a pandemic, right? And I get a certain view of the world. But if I really break it down by saying that out of 1,000 people, only 0.01 gets it, and out of that only so much actually is fatal, which is the literary part of it, right? Which gives me facts the way facts are. Okay. But if I don't understand it and I use metaphors, it can go either way, like loose talk, negative. So this beautiful part of metaphor you're talking about, how do you practice it? How do you take responsibility to it?
Again, let me just kind of ramble through the answer. I'll try and form it as I'm speaking. So I think the difference between data and numbers and things that kind of very often pretend to have clarity is that it potentially loses out on the possibility of an emotional response. And we know that an emotional response is what moves the world, what gets people to do things, what kind of gives a fresh perspective very often. So I think Metaphors, like with many other figures of speech or with ideas, I think has the power of an emotional response, which pure data may not have. Not to mention the fact that even people who are presenting data unknowingly use metaphors, like the sales are shooting through the roof. I mean, what does shooting through the roof mean? I mean, there are people are regularly using metaphors, except that they use the conventional metaphors, which have been tried and tested and done and overdone to the point that you really kind of either don't care much about it, or yeah, it has become a part of the natural language. So the need for an emotional response, which is how people kind of change, their behaviors change, their relationship with something changes, they do something very different. I think that emotional response is a very important reason as to why metaphors would ideally trump our data, or even data would be kind of presented metaphorically. We know of various firms who have come to us with tons of data and told, can you see the story in my data? And the story is a metaphor, actually. A story is like an allegory is a story. An allegory is an extended metaphor. So stories are metaphors because it tells something. So that's to kind of answer the first part of the question, saying that data, obviously there is a value of data and people see the data and find meaning and relevance in the data. But with that, you eventually need to do something, or sometimes you even need to communicate the data powerfully. And you use language, and the language very often metaphors are hidden, or metaphors can be used to amplify it and make it powerful and land more powerfully on the person who's listening to it. Now, the choice of the metaphor, or the idea of being responsible with metaphor, or using the right metaphor, like with any act of doing something new or an act of creativity, which is what actually moves the world forward, there is an element of risk. However, that risk will be mitigated or modified if you take the care to understand all the entire the playground is completely understood. By that I mean, in our world of brand strategy and research, you know who the consumers are, how they relate to something, how they talk about something, what kind of touches their deepest emotional chords with respect to category. What the equivalent of that in the world of poetry or acting is that they deeply are sensitive human beings. They observe life deeply. They kind of make connections. So as long as we take the care to understand the entire foundational pieces, at the act of leaping off and creating a new idea, a metaphor is one, or metaphor is one of the devices by which we can take that leap. And is there an element of risk? Of course, there's an element of risk. That you may not choose the best metaphor. You may not really go wrong with it, as unless of course you're absolutely disconnected from what you're doing. You may choose less powerful metaphors or less magical metaphors. So then you don't unleash the power of it. Like, I'm sure there are many war memorials which are also metaphorical. Like the Washington Monument itself is an obelisk. The Lincoln Memorial has got a huge, almost like a Greek sculpted sculpted Lincoln, and there are, I think there's a Gettysburg address on one side, and there's some other address of his on the other side. I can't remember now. So I'm sure many people are using metaphors. The choice between a magical metaphor and a decent metaphor and a also ran metaphor is the place of play very often. And we know that very often people go down to the path of choosing the more conventional, the more boring, the more obvious metaphor, which is why a lot of communication doesn't touch us, it doesn't move us, it just kind of passes through by us like a ship in the night, and that's a simile. It passes by us like a ship in the night. But if you kind of take the risk and kind of go down the path of either doing something which is a little bit unconventional, like when the first time the Asian Paints ad happened in 2001, and those lines which Piyush Pandey kind of referred to, Har Ghar Kuch Kehta Hai, Chat Batate Hai, Kiska Asman Hai, which is a personification of the house, and that every house has got a song to sing. Again, an ontological metaphor where a house is objectified, a house is made into personality. Unleashed a whole lot of copycats after that. People randomly telling Tare Tim Timare, Nadia Behre, and you kind of, now you don't feel anything. You're kind of bored seeing that same old shit. So that is the degeneration to the conventional metaphor. But if you take a risk like Mayalan, which is absolute magic and inspirational, to some things which are unconventional, like the road less traveled, or Albert Camus telling that autumn is a second spring where every leaf is a flower. Beautifully unconventional way to kind of capture it. And then actually, when you see some of the, we just kind of went on a trek to Sandakfu, myself and Vijay. The colors are like magnificent. We went in the autumn, and they are as beautiful as the spring. But his ability to capture it as autumn is a second spring, where every leaf is a flower. The moment you move to an area of unconditionality, it opens the heart. And of course, it is a creative act. There's a risk in it. But the worst case scenario is you're going to be conventional and boring, and nobody cares about you. Like thousands of ads and thousands of films and thousands of songs, which really we don't care. But there are some things that stick with us forever.
Yeah, I think we have 45 minutes into the conversation. I mean, this is a subject which has got layers and layers to it. I think we'll have to do additional sessions to delve into the application orientation of metaphors. I think we can take some questions from the group, if you have any.
Shall I read out or Naveen?
Yeah, go ahead, Vijay.
Okay, the first question is Sarika. She asked, how does one develop a relationship with metaphors? How can you get better at it? That you start to use it partly at work. Part of it you answered, Rajesh, in Dilip's question, but if you want to expand on this.
Yeah, I think two things, Sarika. I think when you say how does one develop a relationship with metaphors, like I told, there is a source metaphor and there's a target metaphor. The source metaphor is very often concrete, like journey, whatever, cooking and so on. The target metaphor is very often abstract, like life, love, whatever. The source metaphor, you already have a relationship with it. Like we already know what is a journey. We already know that cooking has got ingredients, it's got a recipe, it's got the final product, which can be either an appetizer or a dessert. So when you talk of ideas, as long as you make the connection, your relationship already exists with this cooking. So the ideas are simmering in my head. Let me give you an appetizer. So you already have an inbuilt relationship with the source metaphor or this concrete metaphor. And the act of linking it is the act of magic. So you take these two dissimilar worlds and engage it. And when you engage it, very often you feel like it clicks, like a creative idea, right? It clicks in your head because saying, yeah, that's a beautiful way to tell it. And then when you look at it, not only that linguistic expression works, many things fall in line. Like the moment I tell cooking, you can now create in your own mind what and all is possible with cooking, both conventional and unconventional. So the ideas are simmering in my head. It's a recipe. This idea is a recipe for disaster. Let me put the icing on the cake. These are all conventional metaphors. I'm sure if you kind of engage with that idea a little more, you will find unconventional metaphors. And then again, that entire world opens up. So a relationship with one part of the metaphor always exists. To find that and to connect it to the one that you're trying to communicate is the task. But once you kind of go through this process of letting your mind free, first of all, to have a rich experience of life and to be continuously in touch with powerful stimuli in the world. So if you knew about Maya Lin's Vietnam War Memorial, just the act of knowing that means that it will trigger something in your head at some other point in time. So the more we are engaged in the world, the more we are in touch with various stimulus that is thrown at us, and you're constantly kind of enjoying it, playing it with it, you will suddenly find unconventional metaphors or magical metaphors. Now, once a metaphor sticks, like with any idea, it kind of clicks in your head. Then, like a domino, an entire world opens up. And as you start engaging with more and more, you build a relationship, and then you are kind of greedy to create some other metaphor for the same thing, like told home. The standard thing to tell about home is it's a haven, it's a refuge, it's a nest, because we've all seen that they are visual images in my head. Suddenly, if I tell home is a collaboration or home is a creative adventure, the moment you tell home is a creative adventure, you know it's right, kind of partially right, it feels right, and then you start to explore the metaphor, many things start to fall in line. Why it's a creative adventure. And then the home may not even be a physical space. The act of feeling that you're on a creative adventure, maybe an emotional space along with your partner or whoever it is with your children and so on. So I think that's the way by which I think there's an act of playing involved, there's an act of rich engagement of the world and continuously being sensitive to stimulus involved. And then there are some schemas or concepts that are already there in our head, which we need to tap into. And the mix of all this, I think, will help build relationships, I think.
But what I was also thinking while you were saying this is it true to say that every story therefore is a metaphor?
Every story, yeah, is a metaphor. Every story is, I mean, again, I don't want to get technical about it because in my heart, a story is a metaphor. But when you say what's an allegory is essentially a story which helps you understand something well. So, for example, if I tell a small anecdotal story, like there are, and I read this recently when I was kind of preparing for this webinar. There are two monks, a young monk and an old monk, and they are going out on a journey. And the monk actually belongs to a world where, as per the rules of that clan or that monkhoodness, you're not supposed to engage with women at all, or even talk to them. So these people set off on a journey, and they kind of cross many mountains and rivers. They stay away from civilization, and at some point they reach a river, and the river is in flood, and it's kind of flooding, but it's not flooding to the extent that you can't walk and cross it. But the river is actually at quite a good clip. It's kind of flowing through. On the bank of a river is a beautiful woman standing. And the monk go nearer, and the woman actually kind of looks at them, obviously to kind of request for their help because the river is in fairly the current is fairly strong. Now the monks have their own code of conduct, right? They can't kind of engage with women and so on and so forth. But nevertheless, the old monk, what he does is he quickly goes, he lifts the woman up, and he walks across the river, and he kind of stops the other side. She kind of tells him thank you, and she walks away. The young monk, of course, because of losing out on this opportunity, maybe, he's really pissed. So he crips right through the rest of the remainder of the way, saying, what have you done? You should not have done this. We're very clear about the code of this clan, and so on and so forth. And this goes on for a hour. And finally, both the monks come to a clearing. And the old monk looks at the young monk and tells him, it is you who is still carrying the woman. I left the woman long back. I left her off long back. You are still carrying that baggage, the woman walking around your head. Now, obviously, this story is metaphorical because it's an allegory, but it's metaphorical because it communicates to you how people engage with life. Very often they're carrying their past and unnecessarily screwing up their own time and their peace of mind and so on. To let go of baggage, and this is the story that captures that idea. Letting go of baggage itself is a metaphor. So clearly, stories are a very powerful form of metaphorical expression, without doubt.
Thanks, Rajesh.
There is an interesting question, Rajesh. The question is, brand strategists are often accused of complexifying things and add layers to even simple things. Is it because of the use of metaphor?
Good question. What if I had to flip it on its head, Mohammed, and tell that actually metaphors simplify? Because how would you communicate an abstraction? A brand is an abstraction, right? What is a brand? It looks like it's a strange combination of product pricing and whatever, and the standard stuff that we talk about. But brand is something else, right? It is very often the ownership of a point of view. It is an emotional feeling. It's an added value. How do you communicate a brand? Metaphors actually simplify it because it is an existing code that is already there in people's mind. You're tapping into an existing code which may have taken centuries to create, like myths, right? Are things that are there in a collective subconscious, and myth therefore is a metaphor. It's almost like an emotional DNA. So actually the act of using metaphors, if done elegantly, of course, and if not done elegantly, it may look complicated. If done appropriately, like Dilip has been asking right through, saying that what if you don't choose the right metaphor? If you choose the right metaphor, and if it's done elegantly, which is obviously a creative act involved in that as well, metaphors may actually simplify, not complexify. If anything, not using metaphors could make it complex, because then you have to imagine the pain of trying to communicate the various hues of love. How do you really communicate it? How do you really communicate something abstract as life? Yes, whereas if you want to tell the journey part of life, there's quickly a metaphor. If you want to talk about the adventure of life, there's a quick metaphor. If you want to talk of life as an enemy, like in all the Rambo movies, life is getting at you, you need to fight it. There's a quick metaphor. It quickly kind of distills in your head what you need to do, because those schemas already exist in your head. So metaphors may actually simplify rather than complexify. And brand is therefore a metaphor which simplifies to a large population or a huge mass audience, so that they get in one shot saying, what is this brand about? He's saying, ये इतना product है, इसका price ये इधर बन गया, इसका distribution. It's too complex actually. This is the worldview. This is why we created. It's too messed up actually. Metaphor actually kind of delivers it, evoking an emotional response, and in one fell swoop. Like any idea.
I think there may be a point in that question, because see, it looks like for you to come at the right metaphor, you need to have a very distilled understanding of the issue at hand. Which a lot of work needs to be done. The the first thing aspect of that first principles thinking which people do, and then once that idea sinks into there's a clarity. You start using maybe at the beginning for communicating because it's easier to communicate a complex idea, and through the process you will also understand. But without that, if you actually use it, it can come across like that as complex and layered and not being of any use.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe the next session should be on that, the application of it, how to use it responsibly. There's a third question. What's your favorite example of a powerful metaphor being used by a brand that was not conventional? Essentially, the war memorial example in a brand context.
I mean, I did mention, I alluded to it, Shivani, which is the 1984 ad of Macintosh, where it's done by Ridley Scott, so it obviously has got its scale, but I think the agency was Shared Day logo, I think. And obviously Steve Jobs comes back and he wants to create this disruptive communication to the world about Macintosh getting relaunched. And the entire film is shot. You can kind of check it out at some point, but it's shot where zombie-looking people are marching into this massive hall. They take their seats and they're all looking like lemmings, or kind of zoned out zombies, and they're kind of looking at a screen. And there's this big brother who's throwing out homilies to the world. And then there comes a lady. She's in tank tops. She's got red shorts. On the tank tops, there is a graphic allusion to the Apple Macintosh outline. You can't even see it. She comes in, she's got a hammer in her hand. There's a whole lot of people chasing her. She comes in, she swings the hammer and she lets fly the hammer onto the screen. And the guy kind of throwing out his homilies, that the entire screen kind of bursts open and light kind of streams through. And then it closes saying on whatever, I think 30th January 1984, Apple introduces the Macintosh, and you will see why 1984 is not going to be like 1984. Obviously, it is run twice, I think, once in Super Bowl and once before that. And of course, it almost set into motion a Super Bowl behavior from thousands of companies after that. But to capture the entire George Orwellian world and this dystopian world, and to use that to kind of get back at the world of technology and IBM and so on, and Apple, it's one of the most powerful expressions of the use of metaphor and branding. But I think metaphors are used, like if you remember the army ad of Asian Paints, there is this Radhika Apte. She's engaged to be married to this army officer. She kind of comes visiting him. That's what I think. And she walks into this house. The house is really well done up. It's looking beautiful, but she's mildly kind of provoking the guy who she's going to get married to. And she's kind of passing comments on the over-designed, over-organized life of the army guy. So as she's walking past the room, on the sofa, there are cushions, 4 or 5 cushions, and the cushions are placed perfectly. And as she walks by, she kind of lets it out like a quick quip, saying that ये देखो cushions ऐसा लग रहा है कि वो भी march past कर रहे हैं. Not just the ad, even within that there are simple metaphors thrown in like that, and the moment you hear it, you have a smile in your heart, because you know that it represents the world of extremely orderly world of army life, and you're seeing that in maybe your father-in-law or your uncle or your friends and so on and so forth. So metaphors are used everywhere, but yeah, 1984 is a powerful.
Yes, I was thinking from our own example. I remember we used when we did Dettol many years back, right? If you can use that story, because it clarifies the usage of metaphors, a central idea.
Yeah. So this was, I think, about 20 years back in the aftermath of Savlon getting launched. And if you recall, you may recall, there's a Kunal Vijayakar ad where Savlon came with the idea of no jalan, which is it doesn't burn or sting. And there's a guy kind of in trepidation because he feels that on the wound the antiseptic liquid is going to be put and it'll sting, so he's kind of preparing for it. And then it gets put and nothing happens. So that's the Savlon commercial. So Savlon obviously came in, and it's a J&J product. And they kind of cleaned up a significant share out of Dettol's almost monopolistic position in the antiseptic liquid market. So the natural reaction of Dettol, given that there was a quick erosion of market share, was to do something very quickly And one of the things that might have been discussed at this point in time is why don't you kind of reduce the sting, because people want lesser sting. Nobody wants to go through that horror and so on and so forth. And of course, it had a distinctive smell, it had a glass bottle and so on and so forth. Now, as part of understanding the brand, and that's something that we'll talk of maybe in the next session, you use metaphors to understand the brand. So let's assume that you kind of metaphorically try to play a war game where Savlon and Dettol are enemies fighting in the battlefield. Let's imagine a fight between these two people. What would happen? When I ask that metaphorical question, most customers, including Savlon customers, would tell that Savlon would get rogered by Dettol because Dettol is like too strong. Even Savlon customers would admit to it. Q, because Dettol is like, I mean, when they personified Dettol, again, a metaphor, they tell that Dettol is like a Haryanvi Jat with a lut in his hand, very aggressive, short-tempered, trustworthy, and mindful of people's, unmindful of people's feeling, but a nice guy. So this Haryanvi Jat with a lut in his hand, while it not look aspirational and cool, there was no doubt in people's mind that it would win the fight. Now, from this understanding, again, a metaphorical understanding of Savlon versus Dettol and what would happen in a war scene, we then, or the person who worked on it, a brilliant guy, he kind of then took it to the level of using the myth as a metaphor, which is that there is a hero's journey as a myth. Joseph Campbell has written a book called The Hero with a Thousand Faces. There are beautiful videos as well, interviews with Bill Moyer and so on. The hero's journey is a myth that exists, that resides in our collective subconscious, because this happens across cultures without exception. The hero's journey is this: that every hero is a normal person, and one day that hero is kind of accosted by a discomfort. Something that makes him uncomfortable and that pushes him to the area of unknown, or her into the area of unknown. The natural reaction of the hero, this is called a call. So the hero gets a call. The call is an invitation to go into the zone of discomfort. The hero's reaction very often is to refuse the call. And you do it once, twice, thrice. And at some point, like with the movie Matrix, the bit in a blue pill and a red pill, at some point the hero takes the call. The moment the hero takes the call, the hero goes through a series of trials, tribulations, pain, whatever it is. And at some point, and in this journey, there's always a mentor. Obi-Wan Kenobi, Dumbledore, Gandalf, Morpheus, the white woman in Lagan, Sanjeev Kumar and Sholay. It's the same theme that keeps repeating. There's a mentor in the journey. At some point, after going through all these pains and trials and tribulations, the hero dies. But what the hero dies is a death to the state of infantile dependency and an emergence to the state of psychological self-responsibility. And then he or she takes their riches to the world, and the world becomes a better place. Now, this is the hero's journey as a myth, which is almost metaphorical, because myth is an accumulation of metaphors across time periods, almost like an emotional DNA that's been plugged in because it's happened over thousands of years. Now, how does this relate to Dettol, given whatever we decide as war games and so on? Which is that there is a point in time in each our lives when we are about 6, 7, we kind of are playing in the road, we fall down, we injure ourselves, we get up, we go crying home and tell Mummy, me gir gaya, and Mummy tells Beta, abhi khela nahi, and he puts a little bit of antiseptic liquid or whatever cleans the wound, and then you kind of don't play for the day and just sit down. This happens for 2-3 years, and then there is one day in all our lives, and we know that day, where we are playing, we fall, we get injured. There's a short moment, almost like a momentary reaction, where on that day we decide not to run back home. We turn our face around, bury our tears within our eyes, grit our teeth, and kind of hold it back and kind of struggle through it for about 2 to 3 minutes, go back and start playing. And that's a day for growth. So you've gone through a zone of discomfort. You've taken the call not to run. In not taking the call, you've gone through trials and tribulations and pain. And then what you've died is a death to your past, and you emerge into this area of growth. And Dettol is just a mentor in the journey. Now, obviously, this could be a commercial just off the bat. I'm telling it could be a television commercial. But the possibility of using a metaphor to understand, to make sense of, and then to communicate, all of this can happen in the brand world. And it's magical when it comes together. And we heard this 20-25 years back the first time. We're thinking, wow, that's like a beautiful thing to know. And then you kind of become greedy to know more about it. You watch the Joseph Campbell series and so on and so forth. Yeah, so I'm sure it's used rampantly, like I was telling at the start. Most of them are boring metaphors. But when you find a metaphor like this or 1984, it is just super magic.
Yeah. So
I think we'll need more sessions on metaphors. I think you just whetted people's appetite. So maybe you should schedule a another session. We are like 10 minutes past our session.
Yeah. We will have at least 2 or 3 more follow-up to the session. And thank you everyone for attending this, and good night.
Thanks a lot. Thank you all. Bye.